roll tape.
Roll tape.
Lights, camera, action. We have music. Are we going to play music?
Yeah,
we
can
have some
music.
sort of music.
We'll have an intro.
Bagel Monday theme.
What would bagel music sound like? Round.
Cue the round music.
Welcome to Bagel Monday, the podcast where two data nerds take on tech trends, AI, business insights, and the future of work, all with a smear of humor.
Welcome to Bagel Monday.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Dave.
How are you doing?
You know, I'm great. I'm great.
So what are we going to call our first episode of the Bagel Monday podcast?
I know we're smiling about this already, but we're going to call it How Hard Can It Be?
Take two.
Exactly.
So we recorded a week ago an episode of this, and we had a really great conversation.
And it was the best conversation.
It was really good. You will be sad that you missed it. But you know, we'll see what we can do. So if you're watching the video podcast, which we have as well, welcome. You'll see we've got some pretty nice microphones in front of us, and you know, this ties in interestingly to the conversation. How hard can it be? Because we said we were going to do the podcast, and you know, and how hard can that be came up fairly early on. It's something I say somewhat frequently. And I own a couple of those Bluetooth microphones that, you know, come in a case and plugs into your phone, and you can attach them. And we both wore those and did a sound test. Sounded great. And we said, okay,
amazing.
This is going to work fine. Super simple, you know, entire podcast set up in my pocket, just about.
Because how hard can it be?
How hard can it be? And then we went to edit the podcast, and there was a whole bunch of, not right away, but you got a little in, and there was a bunch of crackles and pops and stuff, and basically unusable. So here we are. How hard can it be? Take two.
Yeah, I feel like that is very apt for any topic, that you make assumptions about how hard something can be, and then you feel like it went so smoothly, so seamlessly, and then you realize that there's a bump in the road, something that you didn't anticipate at all. And I just thought it was so apt for the entire episode and the theme of the episode.
Yeah, I think it is. And, you know, where we started with this was on something much more complex sounding. And, you know, how hard can it be? Here's the thing is, I think we're not very good, like as humanity, at understanding how difficult something is going to be until we go and try it. And you know, what I've seen in my career in software development in particular, I think we're very bad at estimating how difficult a project is going to be.
Yeah.
And we tend to, the larger the organization, the more likely this is. It's kind of why startups exist and are often successful, is because large organizations take sort of small incremental steps because they don't want to disrupt too much. And what I've seen is sometimes the thing that seems like it's going to be way more difficult can actually be the thing that you can get done much more quickly. So, you know, for example, throwing out an old code base and starting from scratch can often get functionality out the door way quicker than, you know, incrementally building on top of what can, you know, sometimes become a bit of a house of cards. And so you're able to build this, you know, new functionality really, really quickly. Sometimes it's, you know, it's the last sort of 10, 20% of something that is usually hard, you know, making it look like it works goes quickly, making it really work consistently in production is, you know, sometimes where it is hard.
I mean, I think that it's pretty apt what you were just describing, because the whole name of this episode came from a work call. And I'm pretty sure it was you talking about something coding behind the scenes of query. And you said, how hard can it be? And I'm like, Dave, that is the name of our first episode right there. And just what you described. Like,
so Sarah, what the heck is this podcast? What are we doing here?
Well, we decided to call it Bagel Monday for a very specific reason, and you can see these delicious bagels right in front of us. But both Dave and I come from a tech background, and one of the most ubiquitous things that has existed in tech is bagels. There's always a specific day of the week that is dedicated to bagels, and Q is the exact same, and it's Bagel Monday. So I think of bagels, and in this case, Bagel Monday, as a day where you can talk to people. You can have multiple different conversations. It's your chance to sit down and talk through things. And that's kind of what this is. We're going to have different topics, different themes. It's going to span from technology to data, AI, the workforce right now, because there's a lot that's being impacted by all of those things all together. So whatever we feel like talking about. Nerdy things. We're going to talk about nerd things.
Nerd things, yeah. And, the world is changing so quickly right now. It's, when we started talking about what frequency should we do this on, it's like we could have a podcast episode every day.
And something
because
new.
The tech world is just changing. Tech world, the business world, the world, it's all changing so quickly. And AI is a big part of that. And, both of our careers have been around, data management. For those of you listening on the audio, Sarah is wearing a shirt that says, it's pronounced
data.
Like,
how do you pronounce it?
Well, Sarah says data. That's what I mostly say. But it's good, ironic nerd humor, because the shirt, when you read it, doesn't help you with the answer. I actually had somebody ask me that question the other day.
How do you pronounce
How do you pronounce it? Now, data, singular or plural, that's where we can really get in on.
Or is it a character from a sci-fi television series?
There you go. So yeah, we're going to cover all sorts of things, and we wanted to start kind of, general, high level. Sarah, why don't you talk a little bit about your background? Maybe we should introduce ourselves here.
Yeah. So I am Sarah Nell Rodriguez, and I am your co-host of Bagel Monday. But both Dave and I live in Charleston, but that is not where my story started by any means. I'm from Wisconsin originally, which is how I happen to say bagel very specifically.
It's true.
So you'll hear that every time you listen to this podcast, is how I pronounce bagel. But my background is education, specifically in data and analytics, and I've had the opportunity to teach data and analytics across the globe, and I transitioned into some customer success roles, and I loved the intersection of data, customer success, and education, and started my own company called Be Data Lit, all around empowering people for those three things. And now I happen to also work with you, Dave, at Q. So I feel like that's a great transition. Oh, and I love cats. That will also come up during this podcast.
I'm sure it will. Yeah. So I'm Dave Ingram. I founded Q about 2 years ago. Also have a background in tech. I was at Oracle most recently. Also live here in Charleston. I did that for about 5 years remotely while living here. Prior to that, I was at a tech company up in Boston. So, I also had my share of working in tech companies in the cold. And we are now in much warmer climates.
Well, how warm is it today?
It's got to be 80 something today.
In April.
Yeah, it's pretty nice weather out.
It is.
And took a bunch of turns in my career, but started out as a web developer, built a consulting practice around content management systems, got involved in Drupal content management system, did a whole bunch in there, which eventually took me to a company called 𝗁𝗂 up in Boston. That's sort of the Red Hat of the Drupal world, supporting open source content management system support and SaaS services. That's where I first became a product manager. I built a SaaS product, a couple of them while we were up there, but I essentially moved up there to take a product management role. Stumbled my way into it. I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point. Didn't really know what a product manager was, but had some ideas for how to make a product that some people needed, and kind of never looked back. Loved the process of designing and building and working with a great team to create something. And, I had my first experiences really working with like trained UX designers at the time and, trained product manager. I was not a trained product manager. I didn't really know what it was. So I had some brilliant people who knew that, and, working with a dev team and then rolling out products, and, lots of lessons, lots of failures, lots of things that were hard, lots of things that were not so hard, plenty of things that were hard, and spent a number of years doing that before moving on to Oracle. Yeah.
I just realized that you and I were both product managers. I didn't know that before today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was a product manager when I was at tableau for their education products.
I don't think I realized that either.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah. Huh. How hard can it be being a product manager?
We could do the rest of this episode on
that alone.
There's no training manual for product management.
No.
There's just you take I developed really thick skin. I think that's my biggest takeaway from becoming product management is you hear everybody's complaints about everything, and then you have to hold in your mind all of these competing priorities. Customer success wants one thing, each customer wants a different thing, senior management wants a different thing. You have in your head, a vision or priorities that you're trying to accomplish, and figuring out how to stack that up and work through it. It comes into teams. You need a good team around you to get things done. And I'll bring that back to how hard can it be. When you have a great team that you're working with, you might have in your own mind that a particular thing is going to be very difficult. But then you go to talk to somebody else who's an expert in that area. I'll keep coming back to software. Maybe it's a front-end development task. How hard could it be to animate this thing when it comes in, or make it a drag and drop, whatever, whatever the front end thing. I'm not much of a front end developer. I can get by a little bit, but I have worked with some really, really brilliant people who they look at a particular task and say, yeah, that's not hard at all. I'm going to be able to crush that. And, they go away 5 minutes later, they've got it done. Mm-hmm. And then there's other things that seem like maybe they shouldn't be that difficult, but because of the way everything's stacked up on top of each other, actually the thing that doesn't sound that hard to me ends up being massive.
I'm actually glad you brought that up, because there are things in the data world that have always felt really hard to me. Data itself, data analysis, math was always something I've struggled with my entire life. It's something I have to spend time on, and I have to memorize it really well in order to do it really well. So for me, the learning curve for that was hard. I would be that person who would say, this is really hard for me. But when it got to the point where I was teaching it, that was easy for me. I love teaching data concepts. I love teaching analytics, because for me, I love simplifying those concepts for people. So normally people would flip-flop that, where they would say the teaching of those things would be really hard for them. How hard could it be? Like, people don't like being up in front of a room full of people. They don't like talking to strangers. That's actually a top 5 fear for people.
Yeah.
And social anxiety. And so teaching people, for them, would be extremely hard. But for me, I love it. And I love helping people realize something that they never did before. So those things that are really hard for me when I'm sitting down and doing them myself are really easy for me to teach. So kind of like how you said, some things are really hard for you to do front end wise, but someone else could do it in 5 minutes. I think it's not only where there's teams or people who can do things differently, but I think it's also the acknowledgement of strengths within those teams.
Absolutely. And, we're here in April of 2025 when we're recording this. And, I would say we're 2.5 years, I guess, into the AI, large language model revolution, whatever you want to call it. Everything's getting
Is there a name
disrupted.
for
Things
it? Have they called it anything?
I don't know if historians have had a chance to name what we're going through right now.
Bagel Monday. We're going to call it Bagel Monday.
But things are changing quickly. And, what's really fascinating to me about generative AI, large language models and the image generation, video generation, all the stuff that's out there now, is things that used to be incredibly difficult are getting much easier. And I view this as this kind of massive opportunity for us all to upskill in interesting ways and do things that we probably weren't able to do before, or we would have had to go to somebody else to help get it done. So maybe core competencies we're able to do faster. But what's really interesting is things where we kind of know what to do, but aren't able to go and execute on it by ourselves. There's all these AI tools that are starting to help. I made a presentation the other day in an app called Typeset, which has some AI for setting up presentation. I was doing a webinar, and it took me 10 minutes to design this really impressive looking PowerPoint. I just sort of typed in what I wanted, and here it goes.
Now I want to go to Typeset.
There's a bunch of them. There's and I've played with Gamma.
See, I've used Gamma, and I was not that impressed with Gamma.
Here's the thing about AI tools is right now, most of them are not very good at editing. They're good at spitting out an initial product, but then going back and tweaking it. That's what the last time I used Gamma anyway, that's the thing I was missing. I liked what it created, but I wanted to change it. And I was back to point and click, drag dropping kind of thing.
You ended up having to create it all yourself again from scratch.
I ended up using Typeset, actually. But there's 𝗵𝗿𝗆 is another one, and it's got some nice features. But we're hitting a maturity level in a lot of these AI tools where we actually have a decent understanding of what AI is pretty good at and what it's just really terrible at. And I think the tools that are really starting to come out now have a good recognition of that. One that I've used a few times, and we've used it internally, I've spent a lot of time looking at, is �lovable. �lovable.dev, I think it is. And it's a web app building tool, but it's made for people who aren't web developers. There's other ones out there that'll write the code, and then you can go and tweak the code, like Cursor, which I actually use when I'm doing development. Love it. Different topic there, but �lovable is just a very simplified interface where you just type in what you want, and then you have a chat interface on one side, you have a web app on the other side that it creates pretty quickly, and then you just prompt for changes, but it's editing this code base for you, and then there's just a deployment button, and it works pretty nicely for a lot of things. There's limits, I'm sure it can't do everything. And what I find is the more complex the thing is that you're trying to do with AI, the more difficult it is to actually have it pull off, because there's context limits and all of those things happening. But you're able to build something pretty sophisticated pretty quickly, up to a limit. And so these things that used to be really, really difficult are getting much easier. And then, sometimes it's surprising which things turn out to be really hard. Sometimes getting a AI to edit something that seems like it would be obvious
isn't.
We had one of those the other day. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, we've been trying to think of the customer experience and what that looks like. And we're trying to reimagine what the customer experience looks like as more of an iterative, agile approach too. Not just a linear path, but multiple paths forward instead. And so we imagined it as a roundabout or traffic circle as well, for those of you who may not be familiar with roundabout if you were Canadian. But you have all these multiple entry points, and we had 5 different entry points that we were imagining. And so we put it into, we tried ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And then we also tried Midjourney,
Yeah.
right? Did we try any other ones?
No, I think just those two.
Yeah. And what a roundabout is pretty straightforward. It's a circle with spokes.
Yeah.
Those were not circles, and those were not spokes that were created.
Yeah.
They were very abnormal.
There was one with basically like a large stone wall going all around the roundabout. So that, it's basically all the roads just dead-ended into this circle.
The wall.
There were a couple versions where it did pull off roundabout, but the thing that it was really, really struggling with, we wanted, for the visualization, we came up with 5 roads coming off of the round. It could not do 5. It could do 4.
I wonder why
somewhat
5,
consistently.
though. Like, is it odd numbers? Is it even numbers?
Well, it's a matter of what has it seen before. It comes down to the training data of what's going into these.
Which is an excellent point right there, the data going into AI. But no, it just, some of them look like a creature less than a roundabout.
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah, they did not work very well. Now, all of this is getting better, and, it's getting better quickly. But I think I regularly talk with people because of what I do. I'm building an AI data platform,
which I love.
Thank you. I end up having a lot of AI conversations with people, and it's interesting just to see like what people's experiences have been. And there's a lot of people who have not heavily utilized AI tools yet. And my encouragement is always just go start using it. There's certainly a lot that you can learn, and there's courses, and there's, a million and one guides out there on how to prompt and everything. But what I find is you just have to spend time with the technology to understand, like, oh, I asked this and it did very poorly, and I asked this other thing. And people are coming up with frameworks to describe this, and there's papers on why it does one thing better than another and all of that. You can super nerd out on generative AI, large language models, and all of that, and I do from time to time. And
you probably will in the future on this podcast.
I'm sure we will get into some deep LLM stuff. I think that'll be fun, but nerdy stuff. But it's also so transformative, right? But I think the big thing with that is that when you start working with it, you get a sense for, oh, that really helped me, and that didn't help me. And when I first started working with these tools, I didn't know which was which. I was very surprised, and I regularly am still surprised which things the LLM ends up doing really, really well, and which things it's really struggling with. It almost always comes down to context. I don't know if we want to do that this episode, but something about context. There's a future episode, something to do with context. But what you put into it matters. What you put into training it, we mentioned that, but then when you're prompting it, how you craft that really, really does affect what you're going to get as a result.
I want to go back to something you just said before, like the fact AI has really just emerged in the last couple of years. And I would say, too, the thing that has really stood out for me in the land of AI is it's made things approachable that weren't previously. So I guess going back to the theme of this episode, how hard can things be? There were things previously that were really difficult to do. And I'll use an example from my professional life, being in education and also actually the product manager role. How many documents did you have to create as a product manager?
I was the worst at that. That was the skill that I was particularly terrible at.
But you have to create, well, first you have to do all your user research.
Yeah.
And then you have to create your vision for your product using all that research. And then you have to go into what your whole plan is to bring this to market and all the other things. But you had to create so many documents.
Yeah, and because you have to communicate it in so many different ways, I think that's where AI is really taking off in marketing. marketing and sales are the ones being maybe the most impacted, because you're just constantly generating content and you have this kind of central idea that you need to communicate over and over again. And as a PM, that's, I'm just constantly in meetings reiterating things. And then, some people, some customers, executives, whatever, sometimes they want it in a presentation, sometimes they want it in a 6-page document, sometimes they want it in a 1-page document.
The 1-pager.
Yeah. We had a 1-pager, and we adopted the AWS 6-pager for a while.
Same. Yeah, we also did that.
Yeah.
Did you do the pre-read right before your meetings?
A couple of times. Yeah. It was often send it ahead of time, and then people were already supposed to have read it. If you're not familiar, the famous AWS meeting is you write a 6-page document, not 5, not 7,
specifically
about
6,
about what the meeting is going to be about your ideas, and then everybody sits and reads it for the first 15 minutes or so
in front of each other,
together, and then they discuss the merits of it. A lot of good ideas in there, but it was
also very awkward ideas.
Yes. So yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of 6-pagers getting cranked out on ChatGPT over at the Amazon office.
But I feel like now, even in education, when you create a class, you have to, again, create lots of documents, just like I did when I was a product manager. And I have to say that when you are 6 pages into writing something, or you're writing your agenda, you're writing your curriculum, you're writing your learning objectives, there are so many things that go into creating education that you lose consistency because there's just so much. And you're human. I like a machine to help me with that consistency. So for me, AI has helped make me a better educator, because that energy I have at page 1 can continue through page 6. And it helps to edit me for that consistency without taking away who I am too.
So how do you get it to do that? Because I feel like that's one of the hesitations that a lot of people have around AI is, well, it's going to make me dumber. It's going to take away my humanity and how I use the tool. So how do you go about that?
I think for me, I've done it a couple of different ways. You have to really know what you're writing first. I can't just have ChatGPT write a course for me on, say, query. If I'm going in and saying, please write a course for me on query, no, I have to already have a fundamental understanding of how query works and what it takes to build a visualization in query and what that entire process looks like. And then all of that has to tie back to an individual, or in education, you call it a persona. And within that persona, then a starting point, their learning patterns, exactly what the learning objectives are going to be, how you're going to scaffold it. So from there, I have a very finite amount of information that I have. If I just said, all right, go in there, teach me statistics, it's not going to know when to end either. Whereas I know where to end based off of my experience. So you as a human have that experience and that understanding that a machine can't bring to it.
Right.
But it can make my language much better. It can be my copy editing to make it better. Does that make sense?
I think so. I talk a little bit, I know with 𝗵𝗿𝗍, you've used AI a lot to kind of flesh out a lot of your materials, and you have an approach there where you have some sort of a document that you always feed into it, right? You want to, am I giving away trade secrets here?
No, not at all. But I do have a document that very much details who 𝗵𝗍𝗍 is, because 𝗵𝗍𝗍 is a company that I call it data literacy for everyone else. But we're all about making data skills accessible to people who don't know data. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know data, you're starting at ground zero there. So I have very specific language around that type of person and what background they come from. I have a very clear mission. I have a very clear vision. I have what are the pain points for each of my personas on there. And you can take that document. So this is my business document.
Right.
And I have like the emotion that exists for each of those different phases too, because that's one of the things too. You don't know an emotion in ChatGPT or any of these other generative AI either. There's not an emotion unless you give it an emotion.
Right.
So within this document, I have like the emotion and everything, words that are essential to who I am, to that I use as a brand. And I can put that into ChatGPT. So it always refers back to it then. And I use that in projects. And so if I'm building a course, I can say, here's who my persona is. And it can always look back on that then. And then here's what I'm looking at for what my curriculum would be. So it always brings in those different points into it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. And this comes back to the context thing that I was mentioning is like, what you feed into the model in order to get some outputs is the thing that's going to drive the response that you get. So giving very clear instructions and giving it the context of, how you want things to sound, what type of words you should use, what type of words you should avoid, all of that kind of brand voice stuff that a marketing department is going to have. You feed that into the AI and it's going to come back with even smarter responses.
I'm not going to go in and I use my mom as an example a lot. Hi, Kathy. Whenever I talk about data, because my mom didn't grow up in a data era. So if I went and talked to my mom about histograms or whatnot, my mom's not going to know what a histogram is. So if I went to ChatGPT and said, build me something on data. What are some of the charts I need to know? I will tell you a lot of places start with histograms. I've seen it.
Yeah.
And so I know the context there, though, that you can't start with a histogram. So again, that's why me feeding some of these things into it, I can provide context, like do not go too advanced on this, and here's why.
Yeah. Yeah, don't start talking about interquartile ranges, right?
ANOVA.
Yeah. I think was it my I think it was my sixth grader had some interquartile ranges we were working on the other day. It's like you learn it in school, but when do you see that again?
Yeah.
Maybe useful, but
or if you call it a box and whisker, even
yeah.
All these terms, though, there's so many advanced statistical terms that that's something I've seen in the data world that people assume you start there, but there's so much that you have to lead up to in order to even introduce that term.
Yeah.
Again, how hard can it be? It can be very hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's bring it back to that topic because there was a couple of things in take one that we talked about.
We did.
Which nobody will ever get to hear.
The best episode ever.
And I think one of the big takeaways, I want to leave people with is you probably don't know how hard it can be and you need to go try it. And I don't know what that is, and that's going to be different things for different people, but taking the first step is often something that seems really difficult in our minds, but actually doing the action and putting something out there and getting feedback, the actual work is often not that difficult. And whether that's building a software product, if you don't even know how to write a line of code, that's actually possible today. Putting up a website, there's so many things. I mentioned
that will do it for
already.
you.
Yeah, there's an increasing number of those things.
I mean, Wix, I think, builds you a website in seconds.
I have not seen it in action, but I had somebody telling me about that the other day, that it's AI prompt and it
asks you questions and it builds it in less than 10 minutes.
Yeah. So, those types of things, and, you have to figure out domain names and how to wire that up and stuff like that. Like there's things that seem like they'd be easy that sometimes are Wix, I think will do all of that for you too. But, you don't know which parts you might get tripped up on until you actually go out and give it a try. But there's so many things that you can just sort of put out into the world much more quickly. And I see AI as this tool that just allows us to level up and become more of a creator, more of a kind of director, orchestrator of all of these tools. And the only thing that's stopping us is, putting the phone away or picking it up if you're going to use stuff on your phone. But, deciding like, I'm going to go try something, I'm going to go put it out there, and it might go really smoothly, and at least the starting point of it is going to be straightforward, and you don't know until you go try.
I have a story.
I want to hear it.
Okay. Exactly that. You don't know unless you try. Because I can get in my own head sometimes. Can you get in your own head?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where you almost build up, like, here's why I'm not going to do it is because of X, Y, Z. And you build it up and you don't ever do it. Well, I have a women's leadership academy that I run through 𝗵𝗿𝗱𝗏. And I had a woman recently who she wants to go through the academy, and she wanted to talk to her manager. And she was just really scared of talking to her manager about this. She thought he was going to turn her down, that he was going to have all these objections to it. And I know from experience, because I've been doing this for so long now, sometimes you have to just put it out there and you have to ask. Because unless you do it, like you said, unless you put that foot out there, you have no idea what the outcome is.
Yeah.
Like, it's Schrodinger's cat at that point. And so you have to put your foot forward. And she was so brave. She did it. She was so scared. And it was the best possible outcome. It was Schrodinger's cat positive. Like, he lived. But
you did say you were going to talk about cats.
Exactly.
I didn't know you'd go that philosophical right from the start.
And then we'll bring cat photos into this at some point too. But she was so scared, and he had such a positive response, and she thought she was going to have to pay for it, but he ended up like offering money to pay for it too. So like, that's an example of, she thought it was going to be so hard, and it ended up being the best possible outcome.
You know, I think asking for help is one of those things that is such a mental block. Like, I'm so scared to do this. But in general, people are so eager and willing to help you in, you know, whatever your goals are. It's not going to be 100% of the time, but, you know, I think that's a great category of how hard can it be? Well, it's going to feel really hard, but, you know, you can reach out to anybody, anytime. And, you know, one of my drives for even starting a startup and, you know, getting much more plugged into my local community and all of that is just the community aspect of it, right? Like, let's work with people. I think people are starving for that. In a, you know, post-COVID world. A lot of us didn't go back to the type of social activities that we might have had before. Again,
it's why I have so many cats.
There you go. And they can sometimes be sociable. I also have cats, and, you know, sometimes they can fill that need. Sometimes they're little brats.
But sometimes you need that community. You need humans too, and you need that interaction as well.
I think it's important, and, you know, one of the ways to like create those deeper relationships is asking for help. And you know, I think it's super important to be willing to go out and, you know, ask somebody for it. If you're starting a business, if you don't know how hard something is going to be, well, go find somebody who's done it before. Ask that question. If you're thinking about starting a business, if you're thinking, you know, or side hustle or whatever, or getting into some new hobby or whatever, you know, one of the easiest steps can be just go talk to somebody about it.
Gather data.
Gather data. That's one way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm hearing two things with how hard can it be. First, you have to be willing to just take that first step forward, and also to put yourself in a vulnerable position of asking. Too, finding out. And that can be asking for more information, that can be asking for help, but it's still a sense of putting yourself out there in a way.
Yeah. And then you have to be willing to keep going when it does get hard and record the second take.
Take two. Yeah, because not everything's going to work out. And I think that's also a lesson in and of itself, too, is when things don't work out, you don't just give up. Yeah.
That could probably be a whole separate episode of when do you keep going? When do you start something? When do you try
when do you
different?
Quit?
Yeah. Certainly times we feel like that. And sometimes it's the right thing to do, you know, so that is an interesting topic.
It is. This feels like a natural end too.
I think it does. So we're going to be putting these out, we think every other week or so.
On a Monday.
With our bagels. And, if you're in the Charleston area, we do actually have bagels here in the Query office. We're going over a year, probably a year and 3 months. I think we started early last year doing this. So, we sit and have these kind of conversations.
I think we need to give a couple shout outs here because you do. Bagel Monday again is Query. Query's here in the Harbor Entrepreneur Center in Charleston. And I think we would be remiss to say, or not to say, that we get Ruby's Bagels.
Ruby's Bagel. Huge shout out to Ruby's Bagels.
Yeah, we're Ruby's Bagels.
Sarah has one right by her house.
Oh,
and
dangerous.
we have one right by our two different places. But
this is from
good.
the Nexton location today.
Yeah. Very solid. So shout out to Ruby's Bagels. Shout out to the Harbor Entrepreneur Center.
And also shout out to Query.
And of course, B-Data Lit.
Oh, yeah. I'm not going to say no to that one.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for joining me, Sarah.
Thank you for joining me, Dave. And hopefully there will not be a take 3.
No, hopefully there will be an episode 2 next.
Yes, episode 2, like Star Wars. Nerd.
See you next time.
Bye.